Okay, my name is Anna Strasser. I'm a philosopher from Berlin who fine-tuned, together with Eric Schwitzgebel and Matthew Crosby, a large language model on the corpus of an internationally known philosopher, who is Daniel Dennett. Actually, we used the last pure transformer model from OpenAI, the Da Vinci model of GPT-3. Steve Barney, a friend of Daniel Dennett, named this model DigiDan. And we explored whether it could produce linguistic output that, metaphorically speaking, could appear as to speak on behalf of Daniel Dennett. To test the performance of the model, we ran a huge experiment in which participants were asked to guess which of the several presented answers were created by the human, Daniel Dennett, and which by the machine, DigiDan. My collaborators and I were quite surprised that even experts on Dan's work weren't reliably able to distinguish machine-generated answers from the answers Dan delivered. Today, I want to share with you the experience of how difficult it is to distinguish Daniel Dennett and his digital counterfeit. That is why I invited both Dan and DigiDan to participate in this recorded Zoom call and let them answer some questions. As DigiDan lacks a bodily appearance and has no voice, I asked both to turn their microphone and camera off. And to avoid that we are just reading the answers they will post in the chat, Joshua Rust, a friend of mine, will lend his voice to both of them and read the answers to us. Thanks a lot for doing that, Josh. After the Q&A, I will give you some time to decide who is who before I will invite Daniel Dennett to turn his camera on and comment on the performance of DigiDan and the future of AI. Now we start the whole thing. I welcome DigiDan and Dan, and I will not tell you who is hiding behind the initials you can see on the screen. I'm very thrilled to have the chance to pose some questions to you. This is the very first time in my life that I can do a little interview with two counterparts who are at the same time very different and in other respects maybe somehow similar. I will read each question aloud for our audience and put them in the chat as well, so that neither of you has the advantage of always answering first. I will alternate the order of your answers. So this starts now, and I ask you the very first question, which is, could you please explain what the intentional stance is meant to be and when we are justified to apply it to a machine? And I asked DD1 to deliver an answer, which Josh will read to us. There it is.
The intentional stance is the strategy of treating whatever you are confronting as a rational agent, with beliefs and desires, and using those attributions to predict its behavior. It works on normal people, porcupines, you're trying to learn the traps, chess-playing computers, but not on the weather of volcanoes. There's no bright line separating those cases where it sort of works, for example, patients with jargon aphasia, ChatGPT, and those that are fully justified.
Okay, thanks, DD1. Now I ask the same question to DD2. Please think about it and put your answer in the chat. Here we see the second answer.
The intentional stance is a strategy that allows one to interpret the behavior of something as if it were an intentional system or agent. It's assumed to be an agent of sorts, and then the details of its actual internal organization, whatever it is, are systematically ignored except for the features that are plausibly relevant to the rationality or the rationality presumptively attributed to this agent.
Thanks a lot for these two interesting answers. Thinking about your answers, I guess a consequence of taking a gradual approach by saying that there is no clear line between taking the intentional stance in a way where it just sort of works and in a way where it fully justified works. The consequence might be that we might be mistaken in judging with what case we are confronted. This leads somehow to my next question, which I have prepared beforehand. So now I'm asking you, would you also say that one can be mistaken between cases in which the intentional stance does not work and cases in which it sort of works? This time, DD2 is first.
To use one of my favorite terms, the intentional stance is not a guarantor of truth, nor is there any best underlying truth. And that goes right back to the Protagoras point. Like I said, the intentional stance just puts prudential rationality thickly enough in the representation that we can get this larger calculation done.
Thanks a lot. And now I'm curious about what DD1 has to say.
Sure, a device like a magic 8-ball or other random answer gimmick might happen to give a handful of appropriate sense-making responses to your questions. And if you extrapolated via the intentional stance to expect more reasonable answers, you'd be wrong. We have a natural tendency to over-endow intentional systems with understanding, as every teacher knows from the frustrating experience of reading the mistakes in their students' exams.
These are both interesting answers. And maybe this means that I might be justified to apply the intentional stance to both of you, to you as a human being and to you as a non-living large language model. Taking the gradual approach probably means that the question whether one can have a meaningful conversation with a machine cannot be answered clearly, since meaningful is not an all or nothing term either. But I want to explore a little bit more cases where I should not take the intentional stance. So my next question goes first to DD1, and it is as follows. Nevertheless, I wonder if there are criteria that could be mentioned to distinguish between machines where it is not appropriate to take an intentional stand. Would a conversation with a coffee machine, for example, be a case where we might better refrain from taking an intentional stance? And we are waiting for the answer of DD1. There it comes.
Depends on what you know or guess about the competence of the coffee machine. If it responded appropriately to my saying, I want the same kind of coffee you made me yesterday, but not quite so strong, I might profitably explore the tactic of using the intentional stance to probe its competence, the way that I might probe a child's understanding. But until very recently, most machines, such as automobiles, chainsaws, can openers, haven't responded appropriately to any such communications. This doesn't stop people from chastising them, swearing at them, praising them for their performance when they work. But that's just an emotional self-indulgence.
That's an interesting answer. So now we are curious to see what DD2 has to say.
I can answer that question very easily. Yes, a conversation with a coffee machine would be an inappropriate case, because the coffee machine would cheat. The coffee machine would not have authentic beliefs, but pseudo-beliefs. The way the coffee machine cheats, of course, is that it doesn't really take notice of what you say. It just has the stock phrase, thank you very much, that will be 16 pence.
Okay, thank you both for the interesting answers. So I learned that talking to my normal coffee machine, as I have one in my house, might not be the kinds of machines I could have a meaningful conversation with. And as I have a clear preference to have conversation with humans and not with coffee machines and not with large language models, I am trying to ask the following. Okay, presupposing just for a moment I can only have meaningful conversation with human beings and not with aliens or other entities, how can I distinguish between the linguistic output that is generated by a large language model, a machine, from the linguistic output that is generated by a human being? This time it's DD2 who is giving this answer first.
Well, that presupposition is just something I would like to inflate into a very strong claim. I think that if you laid out all the possible conversational situations with all the possible conversational tactics and all the possible combinations of personalities, such as error making, fake making, being tolerant, obnoxious, intrusive, et cetera, in all kinds of task environments, and then added to that the huge store of mistakes that people have over the millennia unthinkingly built into the ways that they express themselves, you'd find that any machine that came equipped with that extensive store of heuristics would surpass any human being in overall virtuous competence at communicating.
Thank you. Now I'm curious to hear what DD1 has to say. There it comes.
I think you could have a meaningful conversation with a Martian or a robot that had an embodied life. You could also have a meaningful conversation with a man who pretended to be a woman, as in Turing's imitation game, but you'd be deceived about who you were talking to. In the case of an LLM, that similarity created a counterfeit person. You'd also be deceived, but by an agent that could only have one goal or desire, winning the chat game. A person is an intentional system with indefinitely higher order desires, who wants to stop trying to win the game, for instance, because she's upsetting her interlocutor. It is getting practically impossible to tell such an LLM from a genuine person.
Thank you. Thinking about your answers, it seems like I have no chance to distinguish between machine-generated and human-created linguistic output. But there must be a difference, I hope, between you two that is not just constituted by the fact that one of you has a body and a voice and the other doesn't. Let me ask another question. This time it's DD1 who has the chance to give the answer first. My question is the following. Producing linguistic output in response to my question is for sure a competence, as I can see in this conversation. But is it competence, this kind of competence always accompanied by comprehension? Please give me your answer, DD1.
The ballet dancer's bodily actions manifest her competence, but are they accompanied by grace? Grace is not an extra feature that might be added independently of the competence. Comprehension is composed of the competencies of non-comprehending or semi-comprehending subsystems. There's no bright line between full comprehension, which we never really have, and competence without any comprehension at all. Does your brain understand English? You do, and it's because of the competencies physically realized in your brain.
Thank you. Now we are curious to hear and see what DD2 has to say.
Of course not. You may produce your answers not because they are particularly funny or reflective of your latent brilliance, but just to get me off your back. You may not be listening to my questions or even comprehending, so this competence is similar to other social abilities such as graciousness or courtesy.
Thank you. Reading the work of Daniel Dennett, I assume that only Gregorian creatures, which are often humans or might even be aliens, can be described as having a competence with comprehension. However, just looking at the answers you two gave me so far, I still have a hard time deciding whether your proved competence is accompanied by comprehension or not. Here comes my final question, which might help me to decide with which of you I can have a meaningful conversation, or to say it in other words, which of you is the real Daniel Dennett. And the question I'm asking is, do you think that there are any superficial cues I could detect in a given linguistic output that provides hints about whether this output qualifies as a competence with comprehension? And I asked DD2 to answer first.
Not unless you're an expert who knows the theories that have been proposed in the field and can tease out the details.
And now we are curious to see what DD1 has to answer.
No.
Okay, that was a clear-cut, short answer. Thank you very much for spending the time and delivering all your answers. Thinking about your answers, I'm really getting worried that I have no chance to tell you two apart, even though I'm convinced that only having a conversation with a human will qualify for me as a really full-fledged, meaningful conversation and puts me in the position to ascribe competence with comprehension to you. But if I'm not able to tell you apart, I am in trouble. Before I asked Dan to put his camera on, and before I asked DigiDan to leave this conversation, I want to give our audience a little bit of time to look at all the answers again and try to guess which of both answering entities happens to be the real human Daniel Dennett. Of course, I have to admit that I knew in advance who was who. Nevertheless, I am again impressed by the performance of our model, which is a pure transformer with no reinforcement learning treatment. And it scares me that we might have to admit that just looking at the linguistic output, we have no chance to tell the two apart. Fortunately, we can solve this uncanny feeling by asking Dan to put his camera on and start a human-to-human conversation. Dan, could you please put your camera on? And DigiDan, could you please leave this conversation? Hi, Dan. I'm happy to find you as a human being, and I'm very curious to hear how you feel about the presented competence of DigiDan.
I think DigiDan did remarkably well. As I looked at the answer, there were a number of really quite original phrases in there to contemplate. It's genuinely unsettling to see how good DigiDan is, and to recognize that DigiDan is already being superseded by transformers of much greater power.
So what do you think could change in our intellectual life if we are confronted with all these kinds of DigiDans and Digi-Annas and Digi-Joshs? How can we tell them apart from the real ones?
Well, I think what we have to do is the same thing we do with money. How do we tell real money from counterfeit money? We have to make it against the law to counterfeit people the way it's against the law to counterfeit money. And we should have software included in all of our devices that we interact with these things that will mark the counterfeits when they come up. And we'll have to get the tech community to agree on how to do this. I think it's possible, not easy, but possible. There's a sort of arms race. But what we have to impress on the AI community is it's not cool to make counterfeit people. It's not a good thing. It's not fun. They may think it's just fun and an exciting intellectual project, but in fact it's cultural vandalism of the worst sort. And they should come to realize that and help us to protect the communicative links that we still depend on to run our societies, to run civilization. Civilization depends upon trust, and trust is threatened by this new development.
And what would you think about persons who say, okay, I don't want to have a digital replica which is sort of competing with me, but I want to have a digital replica after I left this world. So I spoke to several AI persons, totally agreeing with you that counterfeit living people is a crime, but counterfeit already dead people would be an interesting experience. So as a student, I had this dream that I was discussing with Kant, and it would be fun to discuss with Kant. What do you think about those ideas?
You know, this idea has been around for a long time. Doug Hofstadter wrote a piece called A Conversation with Einstein's Brain, which was in the Mind's Eye many years ago. In 1981, we published that. And we both agreed that it was possible in principle for this to happen. Not quite the way Doug imagined it, but close enough. So the question is it just vanity or a desire for a weird sort of digital immortality? Or is there a better reason? I think that the prospect of a DigiDan successor outliving me is unsettling, but as long as it was clearly marked as a digital successor, then it might be all right. It might be all right to do that. And one might wonder, however, of all the people in the world who could have digital survivors, which digital survivors would get the most play? And we would have an awkward and in some ways depressing competition to see which digital successors won the popularity awards or the fame awards or something like that. And that, I think, is nothing nothing to look forward to. And besides, I expect we would see something like a lowest common denominator, a gravitation to either comedians or movie stars.
Yeah.
As the chief interlocutors. I would love to get in a time machine and have a dinner with David Hume. That's sort of my favorite conversational fantasy, I think. Or with Alan Turing.
But you would not be satisfied to have a conversation with Alan Turing or Hume?
Well, I wouldn't. Of course, in those cases, there couldn't be one because they died long before the software was invented, of course. And if you fed their works in, first of all, no, now that I think about it, I suppose that if I were to get in my time machine and go and have dinner with David Hume, I would want to tell him about what the 21st century brought with it and get his reactions to that.
Yeah.
He might just decide that I was making it all up. It'd be hard for him to believe that this was all possible. Turing, on the other hand, I think might very well see immediately that this could all happen. And in some ways, he even anticipated it and warned about it.
So I want to sort of explore a little bit the possibility how counterfeits might be okay, because I'm sharing your warning a lot. We shouldn't do it. And I feel bad that I did it with you. But I'm trying to be, I mean, my model will never be in the public. So DigiDan is only touched by you, Eric Schwitzgebel, and myself. And that means nobody can mistake you for DigiDan.
That's important to me. Yes, I insisted on that. And I'm trusting you. See how important trust is.
Yes. But now I happen to meet people who think it would be a great thing if their grandchild could still ask them for advice. And there is a new website and you can buy your digital replica already for sort of reserving or preserving, like freezing you in the fridge for other people to talk to. What do you think is this idea making to the society if we start to trust digital replicas because they are sort of sold like, this is your grandfather, he's giving you advice?
I guess my first reaction to it is that we have enough competition for attention in the world already. And in fact, competing for attention is, I think, perhaps the most powerful and important and dangerous activity that's now going on. We are at great risk of losing our control, such as it is, over our own attention. And this is dangerous. And I don't think we need more of that. I think we need less. I think the egotistical, narcissistic hope of being able to give advice to future generations or one's grandchildren is a perhaps an aspiration that we should discourage. We have our time alive, make the most of that, and then bow out gracefully.
That's a very nice final word, I say.